Thank you all for joining us this evening. I see a number of familiar faces and a whole bunch of new faces, which is spectacular. So my name is David Olson. I'm the Director of Education at Retro Report. I'm going to introduce our other two co-hosts for this evening here in a moment, but we're very happy that you're joining us tonight to learn all about some great tools and resources for teaching about immigration and migration, sort of all across the curriculum. So hopefully you'll come away this evening not only with some lesson plans, but some video resources, some interactive map resources, a whole bunch of ideas of not only how to teach about immigration and migration, but with, in particular, with one of our co-hosts who's here representing Reimagining Migration, some dispositions about how to teach when the students in front of you are immigrants or the children of immigrants themselves. So we're hoping to leave all of you with some wonderful things that you can take with you here. So if you would like this presentation, so the first thing you ought to know is tomorrow I'm going to send you an email that's going to have a link to this presentation along with links to all the other resources that we shared this evening. But if you'd like to follow along with us, you can use the bit.ly there at the bottom of the screen, bit.ly/immigration tools with the I and the T capitalized. But again, I will share this with you if you just like to sit back, listen, ask questions, that sort of thing as we go through tonight. So again, my name is David Olson. I'm the Director of Education at Retro Report. I'm joining you this evening from a chilly and rainy Madison, Wisconsin, where over the past 12 hours, the temperature has dropped 20 degrees. And I was telling Annie and Abir earlier that I looked at the extended weather forecast and it's going to be a week before we see 50 again. So I hope some of you are joining us from much nicer places. So I'll next introduce Annie Evans. Annie, tell us about yourself.
Well, I feel bad because it's 84 degrees here outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. It was 59 yesterday. So you went up 20 and we went up almost 30. But I am with New American History out of the University of Richmond here in Virginia, and I'm delighted to be with my friends this evening. The best news is everything you see is an OER resource. There is no fee, there is no subscription, there is no paywall, there is no login. It's just free resources we hope you will use and find useful for you and your students.
Awesome. And our other co-host for this evening, Abir Shinawi.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Zabir Shinawi. I am representing Reimagining Migration. I am the Associate Director of Programming. Our organization is located in Boston, but I tell people I telecommute because I am located in Maryland. But currently I'm sharing the same weather that David is because I'm visiting my family in Chicago, which I technically call home. I'm excited to be here, and hopefully many of you will learn about our organization, what we do. And I do see some familiar faces. I'm going to give a shout out to our fangirl, Corey Loyola, who I love seeing all the time, but welcome to everybody.
Wonderful. Awesome. So our plan for the next 54 minutes here is you're going to hear from the three of us and our organization. As Annie said, all the resources that we're going to share with you entirely free, vetted, created by teachers and people who have been in classrooms. Actually, Abir, myself, and Annie, all former classroom teachers ourselves, and so hopefully what we're sharing is things you can use in your classroom. And our goals for tonight are to examine some different strategies here to help students really develop some of those dispositions for approaching the topics of immigration and migration with some empathy and some nuance. As someone who taught both world history and US history along with a number of other courses, that immigration is one of those sort of universals, right? Human migration is something that has happened since there were humans, and there are all sorts of different entry points to be able to understand immigration and migration. And we also know, and I could tell you as someone who for a long time taught political science related courses, government and civics courses, that immigration is not only universal, but is nearly universal as a hot button topic, as something that is fiercely and sometimes angrily debated as a topic of who should be allowed to move where and when and how. So understanding, how we approach these issues is something that's very important, along with, making sure that your students are approaching these issues with empathy and with nuance. We're going to explore some issues with immigration and migration over time. You'll see that in a number of the resources that we share, along with some interactives. I'll be sharing some video resources. Annie will be sharing some wonderful interactive map resources. So we have plenty of things for you to help so that your students aren't just sitting and absorbing, but that your students are using those inquiry skills to try to gain some of this knowledge for themselves and to be able to ask new and interesting questions on some of these topics. So first up, I'm going to turn it over to Abir. And Abir, you just let me know when you need me to advance slides here.
Sure, no problem. So thank you for sharing our website link in the chat. We have a lot more information there, but I would like to start off by just talking about what we do and how we approach teaching about immigration, migration. Just like David said, it really is a hot button topic, and it shouldn't be, because if we think about unless you're indigenous to this country, everybody has a story of migration, whether you're 10, 20 generations in or first generation like myself, everybody's got a story. But what we also want people to understand is what knowledge and skills are necessary for a world of migration. When we talk about students of immigrants and migrants, we're also talking about how we want to structure our school climate for them really benefits all students. We don't live no longer in a sheltered world. As you see, whether your own students or your own children, kids are very connected, whether it's social media or whether it's other students in the classroom. So we need to really develop kids who are going to be civic minded, as the C3 standards talk about, but also they're going to come in contact with people who may not share the same different cultural aspects as they do. And how are they going to be able to relate to them? Because later on, they're going to end up working with them or living with them. And we're seeing that happen a lot right now, especially in the United States, where I've had teachers from extreme rural places in the country like Iowa and Idaho who've said, we have this influx of Syrian refugees, or if you go to Minnesota, which David would know, Somali refugees, which is, if you think about Somalia, you're thinking, what the heck are they doing in Minneapolis? But it's all based on where they're going to be resettled and how is the community going to really, what's the reception going to be with that? But these are the questions that we always have educators ask and think about. What experiences, knowledge, and skills do students bring? Because we always believe students should be looked at in the asset mindset, not the deficit mindset, especially when we're talking about immigrant and migrant children. I was having this conversation with my mom yesterday because, again, I'm a child of immigrants, I'm first generation, and we were talking about the L program. Why is it that when I was growing up, I didn't have it, and I spoke Arabic first and English as well. And we were just talking about how that really enabled us to go in with that asset mindset of kids are able to code switch into 2 languages as well. What should students know? What should they know about migration or immigration, how it's really impacted our country, but also how is immigration and migration looked at globally? We've seen this come to head right now, unfortunately, with the crisis in Ukraine, but also people have seen the ugliness that's come out and that's deflected from what's going on in Ukraine by how other migrants and immigrants are being treated in neighboring European countries. What should students understand? What parts of immigration and migration should students know? And based on their social and emotional learning, but also, as we all know, what should kids know at different parts of their journey in elementary school and connected to middle school and to high school and beyond? And finally, what should they be able to do? Everything that we do with Reimagining Migration is tied into civic action. We want our students to understand that just because they cannot vote doesn't mean that they don't have a voice, and they're really able to create some sort of change and something that's connected to whether it's their civic duty, it's a civic action. I know a lot of schools do community work projects, or they have to get credits in order for them to graduate. So this is something for students. What can they do? How can they help create what we call welcoming and inclusive environments? Next question. And I'm sorry, next slide. And as I speak, if you need me to go back to something, please let me know, put it in the chat, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. So we have 5 dispositions and habits of mind that we really like teachers to focus on, and educators and community members. Our work isn't really just focused on schools and teachers. We believe that what happens in the community spills over in the school and vice versa. And when I worked with the school system and I worked for the Office of Social Studies, I would get phone calls or emails from department chairs saying, you know, something happened in our community over the weekend. Now the kids are talking about it and it's causing an issue. How can we resolve it? But these are really good perspectives to keep in mind. Understand perspectives on how about others, but also empathically, but also sympathetically. We want them to be empathetic with other people, but sometimes the empathy unfortunately turns into pity. We also want students to develop sympathy. What is it that they can do in order to help the journeys, or understand more about the journeys of the people who did come from either they were displaced or they came here for other reasons. Inquire about human migration with care and nuance. I love how David said, migration is the human story. We've been migrating since we've been walking. So how are students understanding that migration is the human story? And how is it something that you can interweave in your classrooms, or especially my history teachers, because I'm a history teacher, how could that be the foundation of the history you're discussing? Communicate and build relationships across differences. That's very important, because we want our students to develop the skill sets in order for them to be better civic-minded citizens, but also that's what makes a democracy so strong, is being able to have these differences. You can agree to disagree, but how are we going to come together and build a relationship to create a stronger community? Number 4 is one of my favorites: recognize power in inequities in human experience and migration. Going back to my comment about what happened in the Ukraine, unfortunately, but then having students understand why were other migrants and immigrants, such as African migrant and immigrants or Syrian migrants and immigrants, treated differently than people who did come from the Ukraine? What are the inequities? What are the policies that are put in place? We always start a lot of our sessions with Wong Kim Ark, who for me is my hero. And if many of you who do know him understand his story, really quick, he was born in San Francisco in the United States in the late 1800s, went back to China, came back, and they denied him entry, saying that he wasn't a citizen. He fought the system. Yep, 14th Amendment for the win. He fought the system. He went to the Supreme Court and he won. Because of him, I'm able to be who I am as a child of immigrants, born and raised here, automatic citizen, right? But he also talks about the power in the inequities in the policies, because the Chinese Exclusion Act is really like the blueprint for all other immigrant policies that come after. So it's very important to students understand that as to why certain rules, certain laws, and even certain communities, redlining. I just found out the other day that Silicon Valley was built more in the west side of California as opposed to the east, for those reasons as well. And those are very important for students to understand. Finally, so they can do number 5, is they can take that information and what is something that they can do to improve upon what's already been done, or what is something new that they would like to work on. A lot of kids love the concept of climate change. We can't deny climate change to be part of the migration story, because it is, because climate change is going to cause people to have to leave, whether it's drought, whether it's famine, whether, we were just talking about a tornado watch that happens. We saw what happened in Louisiana with Katrina. People were displaced there. So what are kids or students going to be able to do with all of this information in order to create sustainable societies? Next. Thank you. So how should we teach about migration? This is the golden ticket, right? This is the Willy Wonka ticket that everybody wants to know. How do I teach it? What do I do? And how do I do it without getting in trouble? I totally understand. I've been in the classroom for years. Teachers get attacked for doing things that they're well-meaning, but then they want to make sure they're doing it right because they want to bring it to the classroom, because, that's what we do. So these are the questions that you could really look at. Migration is a through line of the human story. Again, we've been migrating since the beginning of time. Nobody's new really to anything unless they're indigenous to that place, and especially in the United States. It is a shared experience, but all migration experience is also not the same. Although that's the beauty of it, is we can all come together and talk about our migration experiences, but we also have to honor the differences that people experience. How in especially when people make the comment of, oh, well, my great grandparents came and they came through the right way, blah, blah. Well, yeah, but your great grandparents didn't need a visa. Your great grandparent didn't need, they totally changed systems in order for them to get here. So migration experience was always different. And also, I was always fascinated by the fact of certain groups of people, at certain time periods who weren't considered a particular citizen. Like I was flabbergasted when I found out the Irish were not considered white. Oh, so that experience for them really changes how you teach about Irish American history and how there are certain communities and neighborhoods developed. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, strong Irish Catholic communities, but now you understand how those systems really transformed how they developed with their own communities. What should students learn about the similarities between these experiences? We want them to understand that there's a commonality, because when you understand the similarities between these experiences, you have a better understanding of how you can dismantle some of the disparities that a lot of these migrants and immigrants are experiencing. I use the Ukraine as an example because everyone now is talking about the Ukrainians, unfortunately, moving, say, to Poland or to Germany. The honeymoon phase, unfortunately, is going to wear off very fast, where the people there are going to be like, well, why aren't you assimilating? Why aren't you doing something like we are? You're not being German enough, or you're not being Polish enough, or whatever. They have that commonality, but also their experiences are going to be similar to a lot of other people because they're displaced like everybody else. And it's a very traumatic experience, regardless of where they go. What should they understand about the differences between them? Same thing. We want to honor the fact that we have similarities, but also we want to honor the fact that some of these experiences are very different. We can't deny the fact that the Black American experience here was a forced migration, and that generational trauma and the policies and the systems that have been put in place for decades and for centuries really affected the Black community very differently than everybody else. So we need to honor the fact that they may have similar experiences to other migration stories, but theirs is very different and unique, and we need to make sure that we understand that as well. And finally, how should that knowledge shape young people's understanding of their role in the world today? A friend of mine who works at the University of Arizona had a really great mini TED Talk, and she spoke about how students nowadays, unlike my generation, maybe generations in the past, they had these sense of identity, and they had more what we would call identity politics. Kids nowadays gravitate towards what they consider social justice movements. They will be connected to a social justice movement because they themselves are very empathetic, very sympathetic, and they look at themselves as a community more than really like, no, it's a Black-white issue, or it's a LGBTQ issue as opposed to a straight issue. They really dig deep and develop their own sense of identity based on the circles that they hang out with, and the fact that social justice is their identification piece. So how are kids able to take all of this information and understand the role that they play in the world today? Next. So I love our learning arc, and I'm biased, but I can be biased. This is the foundation of our work. So whenever we work with educators, and we have educators ask us, well, I really want to talk about the Great Migration North, or I want to talk about the Chicano movement, but I really don't know how to place it in the curriculum or how to place it in what we're doing in school. We always start off with our learning arc because it's such a great way of putting everything in perspective. The very first part of the moving stories is, like we said, everybody has a story of migration. What is yours? What is mine? And that piece right there, where we have done that activity with people, and we've paired people who would uncommonly probably have never talked about their migration story, or people who in the beginning were like, well, I don't have a migration story, actually end up digging deeper and finding out that their story is something of value, and their story is something that's very appealing, and just as anybody else, because you don't have to be totally new to be here. I always tell people also the concept of migration within a country. I mean, our country's huge, and we have cultural pockets, and just moving from one place to another is a very big migration story right there. The second part is understanding migration. There are 3 subtopics that go with that. Number 1, what was life like before migration? There are a lot of stereotypes, there are a lot of tropes of what a migrant looks like. They're all refugees, or they're all asylum seekers, but people have come for different reasons. We have people who've come here on student visas. We have people who've come here because of work. They've actually been recruited. I learned recently the history that Ford himself in Dearborn in Detroit, Michigan, and why there's a large Yemeni population in Michigan is he actually recruited Yemeni shipbuilders because they knew the state of the art techniques to build those machines, and he wanted that expertise to build his cars in Michigan. Therefore, you have that large Yemeni community. But before the migration, they didn't come because they had to flee. That was one reason why they came. The journey, going back to understanding the similarities and differences, honoring people's journey. I always tell people that when people flee their country, it's not something that they just up and want to leave. It's a really traumatic experience to be expelled or have to go through war or have to face gangs that you're or war or civil war in your country. So when people have to take up that journey, we have to honor all of the experiences they have, because it's not an easy task to get from one country to another, especially coming to the United States, regardless if they're coming south of the border. People have been walking for months, right? So it's one thing that they left their house. That's one form of trauma. Trying to get here and getting stuck, that's a second form of trauma. And then coming here and trying to adjust, that's a third form of trauma. So just thinking of all the layers and the nuances that come with it. Finally, the adjustment period. What does it take for people to adjust? We have a lot of services in this country where they do give people the resources and the money to adjust. But after a while, it doesn't last long. It's only a couple months. And if you think about an adjustment period to live in a country that's totally different than your own, not only are you learning the language, you're learning the system. Just go to the grocery store is something totally foreign and totally different for people. So we always say at Reimagining Migration, we like to say that the onus is on the community to help people with the adjustment, as opposed to vice versa, where people have to fend for themselves. And finally, turning to action, going back to what I said, how can students and community members work on using our learning arc and asking the right questions in order to create inclusive and sustainable societies? I do want to share a little bit more depth with our learning arc. Let me share my screen. Then forget it. That's okay. It's going to mess up the whole system. That's all right, David.
I think I have to unshare mine and then.
No. So that's definitely something. I'll throw it in the chat. And then what we do with our learning arc and our moving stories is we dig deeper into the questions. And these are the questions that really allow teachers to get to know their students, but without it being too intrusive. And it's not like the typical, hey, what's your favorite sport? And what's your favorite ice cream flavor? You really dig deeper, and it really helps students develop their own sense of identity and share what they want to share, as opposed to kind of being forced to share things that they're not too comfortable sharing as well. And I will throw that in the chat right now, just so if anybody's interested in looking at some of those questions while we discuss, you are more than welcome. Copy. All right. So what I would like to say in conclusion, based on all of our work, I hate working in silos. I think that's one of the downfalls of our education system is if you're an ELA teacher, you stick with your ELA people. And if you're social studies, you're social studies. And I have a chip on my shoulder because ELA was always overlooked better than social studies. But no, we're finding out research that, social studies is where all the skills are at. But our approach to teaching is really cyclical. That's what we do. Everything is intertwined. You can't talk about one piece without talking about the other, whether you're talking about students and you're talking about their community. If you're talking about their community, you're talking about how it impacts schools and classrooms. Let's just talk about curriculum. How are communities and board members really impacted the curriculum, and who's writing the curriculum? And finally, the course and the disciplines. Who is coming in and saying what should and shouldn't be taught? And everything really should be revolved around the way students should be taught in a holistic approach, as opposed to just in silos, and using our resources like the learning arc and the moving stories and the dispositions really gives you a holistic approach to teaching about immigration and migration and the history in this country. And I would like to conclude by saying we do have our summer seminar, which this time we are having in person. If you'd like to learn more, I'll add the link in the chat. And it is in Boston from June 28th to the 30th. Among the topics will be the Great Migration North, the Chicano movement, and Angel Island compared to Ellis Island, because I think Angel Island gets neglected and people don't know or learn much about it. So you're more than welcome to come and join us. It's going to be a fun time. Boston is a fun city. And I will add the registration link as well for anybody who is interested to learn more. I know I gave a mouthful of information, but if there is anything anybody would like to add or have any questions, please let me know. And thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, Abir.
Appreciate it.
And by the time we get to late June in Boston, well, is it going to be warm or is it going to be like ungodly warm in Boston?
I'm not from Boston originally, but yeah.
Excellent. So as we transition to talking about sharing some specific lessons, resources, videos, interactives, that sort of thing. I know a number of you who have joined us tonight are familiar with Retro Report, which is wonderful. I'll give you just the quick spiel, particularly for those who are unaware. So Retro Report is a nonprofit journalism organization. What we do is we make films, short form documentaries, really with the goal of connecting past and present, of relying on this marriage of investigative journalism, of great storytelling, first person interviews, archival footage, to put it together to try to help make sense of the world in which we live, to look at moments in time that we're living through now and figuring out what's the historical backstory that will help us understand where we're living and what we're experiencing. In total, Retro Report has a library of over 250 films, all of which are entirely free on our website. On the education side of our website, there's more than 80 films. All of the ones on that side have at least some educational resources to go with them. So ranging from full lesson plans, student activities to it's discussion and comprehension questions, background reading, and that sort of thing. What we have to share with you tonight is a brand new collection looking at immigration and migration, including with a video that was just released about a week ago or so, that really tries to help put in context this moment we're seeing with what do we owe to refugees, to immigrants who are fleeing war-torn areas. When we originally started putting this film together, in here, we'll talk about it here. As we first started putting this together, it really was focused on looking at Afghan refugees who were fleeing Kabul this summer. And as we were creating it, we found ourselves, as I said before, we get, immigration stories, migration stories, they're ever present, right? So as we were creating it, well, lo and behold, we get another major world conflict, which sends millions of people spilling from their homes across borders, trying to find safe haven. And so, it's one of those things that I really think that when you focus on immigration and migration issues, you will always be able to connect them to what's happening currently in the world. As a social studies teacher, I made it a mission in my class to always try to connect what we were learning in the curriculum to what was happening in the world. I thought it always made it so much more powerful for students to be able to connect those lessons of history to current events, to the world that they are experiencing. So here, the big essential question from this film is, what obligation does the United States have to refugees fleeing from war-torn countries? And here, there's a full lesson and activity that examines U.S. immigration policy at several different points in history and incorporates, I'm stealing a little bit of Annie's thunder here, but this amazing interactive map from American Panorama, which allows you over time, dating back to the 1850s, of being able to look at immigration patterns to the United States from all sorts of different countries, but also at the county level within the United States. So amazing stuff. So I want to show you a short clip from this film, and then we'll take a look at the lesson.
Many Ukrainian refugees will.
Let's see if I can. We're gonna watch it on YouTube and see if I can get it full screen here.
Will wish to stay in Europe, but we also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States.
The U.S. is opening its doors to some of the millions of Ukrainians who have fled their homes to escape the violence of the Russian invasion.
is the biggest number of people displaced in Europe in the shortest amount of time since World War II.
What obligation does the U.S. have to refugees whose countries have been torn apart by war? It's a question the country has often faced.
Afghans are thronging to Kabul's airport.
Most recently, after a precipitous withdrawal from the war in Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban in August 2021.
I have all documents to go US. Please.
In the chaotic evacuation of Kabul, priority was given to Afghans who had worked alongside U.S. troops in the decades-long war against terrorism and faced reprisal at the hands of the Taliban, like Namat-ul-Ajagori.
I'm sure if the Taliban knows that I work with them, they will kill all of us, my whole family.
As the U.S. takes in families from Afghanistan and now Ukraine, what can be learned from the experiences of a different set of refugees who arrived in the U.S. nearly 50 years ago?
When I saw the footage of the fall of Kabul, I said that was us in Saigon in 1975.
In 1975, Carolee Tran was 8 years old and living in Saigon as the Vietnam War finally neared its end.
In Vietnam, my family and I were upper middle class. My father, he was a major in the Vietnamese army. We had a very comfortable life.
But all that changed as the army of Communist North Vietnam closed in on Saigon and the U.S. pulled out the last of its troops and diplomats.
There was this sense of impending doom. Several people said to me, begged me, please take my children out of the country with you.
People like Carolee Tran's father, who had fought alongside American soldiers, were desperate to have their families evacuated to safety.
People, lorries, and cars, all chasing one American evacuation convoy after the other.
But American officials, unprepared for such a quick exit, knew they couldn't save all their allies.
Who could be killed, who would be tortured, who worked to advance our government's interest. So who do we owe?
Saigon, April the 30th, the last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees. Scores of people still crowded onto the embassy roof in the vain hope of rescue.
All right, that's all you get. Just a tease on that one. So it's a great film. So it's about 10 minutes long. Like all Retro Report films, they're usually in that like 5 to 12 minute range. Really great for classroom use. So here we get to hear more from Carolee Tran about her experiences. We jump back to Namat Al-Jagori and his family, and hear again some of these different perspectives. We hear a little bit about how laws have changed at different points in time that have led to changes in how we treat refugees, particularly from countries where we had involvement. And so here, this is the page here, and Isadora Verajao is another Retro Report staff member. She'll put the link in the chat there. But here on the collection page, we've put together 3 different films, including the one that we just saw the snippet of. And you'll see you can find the lesson plan and student activity here. We'll also see a snippet of this film about Prop 187 and the effect there on this piece of legislation in California and the impact it had not only on the immigrant community, but also on California politics in general. Along with the third one in this collection, it looks at sanctuary cities. Not only the contemporary controversy over sanctuary cities, but looking back to the 1980s, where before we had sanctuary cities, we quite literally had sanctuaries where a number of churches in the American Southwest and elsewhere throughout the country were taking in and shielding migrants from Central and South America. So again, all of these are available on this page. When you come back to this page, maybe by the end of the week, there'll also be the recording of this session and some of the other links that we share this evening. But here, if we check out the lesson page for how the U.S. has treated wartime refugees, We can click here, look at the lesson plan and the student activity. Just a quick note, if you're unfamiliar with some of the resources from Retro Report, the lesson plan really is the teacher-facing document. The student activity is obviously the student-facing document. The lesson plan will tell you, here's how you might use this, a brief overview, what subjects it might work for, looking at objectives, questions, links to all of the different materials that are used in the lesson itself, how it goes through. And then if you're one of those folks who, as you're writing up lesson plans, needs to connect to standards. Now, I don't go through and connect to all 50 state standards because that would not be a good use of my time. But here, we always connect to Common Core state standards for literacy, connected to social studies, social sciences, along with the C3 framework for social studies. So at least give you some starting points if you need to reference standards. If we look here at the student activities, again, we always create these in Google Docs. So it's hopefully as easy as possible for you to click on File, make a copy, and then you can make whatever adjustments that you would like to lessons like this. If you need to scaffold, for your students, if you need to, create some questions that call back to what you were doing yesterday or 2 days ago in class, if you need to, replace some of the vocabulary, try to make it as easy as possible. So here, there's a link to watch the film. And then this activity has students go and examine 2 different pieces of legislation. So the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which if we look at all of the legislation connected to immigration in this country, this one may have had maybe the most substantial impact, or at least within the last 100 years, arguably the most substantial impact. So here, having students go ahead and take a look at this. So again, this is some primary source investigation for students. And then one of the laws that's referenced in the film, the Refugee Act of 1980. So that happens really in response to the US involvement in Vietnam and trying to work with Vietnamese refugees. So again, this one takes you to the National Archives, again, to look at the primary source. And then the pièce de résistance here, our interactive map. So this one, foreign-born population, a nation of overlapping diasporas. And Annie, if you need to jump in and have things to chime in about this map, please do. So American Panorama, which is part of Annie's organization, has this amazing map, which if you look at the slider along the bottom here, you can go and take a look at any decade from 1850 on to examine where people were coming from who made it to the United States. And so here, again, like no matter where you're teaching US history, right, you can find places to work this in. It's one of those that you probably can return to at several times during the course of the year as you're analyzing different events. And so here, try to ask your students, what are some of the differences we see at 50-year intervals with where people are coming from? How many people are coming to the United States? One of the things I find obviously very interesting here. So obviously, if we look, and again, big changes in the middle of the 20th century. But then over here in this box, you can search by county name. So I happen to live in Dane County in Wisconsin, which is derisively known as 77 square miles surrounded by reality. But here we can take a look at where are people coming from who end up in Dane County. So here in the year 1970, still the largest percentage was Germans. If you know much about Wisconsin, you know that's pretty common across decades. But here, how might that be different from 1870, right? Where places, well, here's Sweden, Norway, Germany, right? And then if we look at 2010, where are people coming from who end up in Dane County in Wisconsin? And here, Germany, well, man, it's still there, strangely enough, still in the top 10. but ahead of it are places like Mexico, China, India, Korea, Laos, places like that. So here, again, a whole bunch of ways you can have students play with this resource and investigate different things. So that's one. This is the brand new film, how the U.S. has treated wartime refugees. I'll show you a little snippet of this film as well. This one looks, again, sort of more at a snapshot in time of the 1990s. I think many folks can point to as one of those turning points in the rhetoric about immigration in this country, and our attitudes towards what you'll see in the film as most commonly referred to as illegal immigrants, which now even asking your students, well, why are we hearing that word, that phrase, and what's the more common phrase we would use today for people who are in this country without proper documentation, right? And so you can hear some of the differences in rhetoric. And so again, this one has a full lesson in student activity. The essential question that goes with this one is, how has U.S. immigration policy and the rhetoric that goes with it changed over time? And then I'll also show you here, we have the one looking at sanctuary cities, but we'll take a quick look here at the snippet from this film.
The Kileys helped come up with Proposition 187, a ballot initiative that would deny government benefits to undocumented immigrants. Peter Nunez became an early supporter.
The idea was, let's make California an unfriendly place for people who are here illegally, with hope that no more would come and that those that were here would leave.
Their children would be kicked out of public schools. Educators and healthcare workers would be required to report anyone they suspect of being illegal.
It was considered an extreme idea by Democrats and some Republicans, who said it would unfairly target immigrants for the state's economic trouble.
The immigrants that were coming here were doing jobs that nobody wanted to do. They were farm workers, they were people who were janitors, they were maids.
Opponents labeled Proposition 187 immoral and racist.
Taking innocent children and throwing them out on the streets, that somehow is going to solve our illegal immigration problem, is simply fallacious.
People thought it wasn't really going to have much of a chance, but it turned out it hit a nerve.
More than 600,000 Californians have signed petitions calling for a halt to services illegal residents receive.
And then it got picked up by the politicians.
Republican Governor Pete Wilson, who was in a tight race for re-election, threw his campaign behind Prop 187.
Governor Pete Wilson asking the state with the highest unemployment to give him a second term. Wilson says, don't blame him, blame illegal immigrants.
The federal government won't stop them at the border, yet requires us to pay billions to take care of them.
Wilson's campaign ad felt like a personal attack to Kevin DeLeon, even though...
All right, and we'll stop there. So again, gives you a little bit of a taste. I think one of the things I really like about this video is and really how I ended up designing the lesson is, to me, it tells this very interesting story of intended and unintended consequences. We get to do some analysis of cause and effect. One of the things that sort of comes out here is, so not only does Prop 187 pass in the state of California, it gets struck down by a federal court as being unconstitutional. It never actually goes into effect. But the political backlash that comes from it, in particular from the Latinx community, is one that leads to a very politically motivated and engaged Latinx community. And if you look at the political makeup of the state of California in the 1990s versus the political makeup today, it's vastly different. We see a much larger base for the Democratic Party and a much more engaged Latinx community politically. And so here, the student activity that goes with this one, it has students examine the text of Prop 187 to figure out what would it actually do. Again, this is one of those things I always think is important when we hear, even in a Retro Report video, we hear these snippets on the news of, here's what the bill would do. Have your students actually go and read it. Have them figure it out for themselves. This is one of those things, recently in the news, There's the recent legislation in the state of Florida looking at what can be taught related to LGBTQ plus communities, which has been called the Don't Say Gay bill in the press and in social media circles. That's one. Have your students go look at that if they're interested. Go find the text of the bill to figure out what is it that's actually prohibited. So here, have your students go look at Prop 187. Then there's the link to the film with a handful of questions, and asking your students to identify some cause and effect relationships within the film. And then this part, I think, can be pretty versatile. I went through and identified essentially in American history, the top 10 to 15 pieces of legislation, mostly at the federal level, but a couple at the state level, that have either encouraged or discouraged immigration into the United States. So have your students look at some of these. Now, if you're teaching U.S. history in a particular time period, well, there's just about every time period represented here. So have your students hone in on a particular piece of legislation and make a comparison to a different time period. Have them go hunt for, find me one that encouraged immigration and find me one that discouraged immigration, and make a comparison between the two. So here, plenty of options for you. All right. So I think that's all I'm going to share. I'm now going to turn it over to Annie. You got to unmute yourself though first, Annie.
Okay, I was waiting for you to unshare. Are you done? Okay. Can you see my screen? All right, great. So I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but if people will stick around maybe a few minutes past, I don't want to shortchange anything. I am with New American History, which comes out of the brain and the imagination of Dr. Ed Ayers at the University of Richmond. Ed has spent literally his whole career playing in the realm of digital scholarship, creating digital tools, digital maps. His Valley of the Shadow project, which was considered the first large digital scholarship humanities project, is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. For those of you who are fans of that project, we have a refreshed version coming very soon, which I think you'll all be delighted to see. And that traced migration during the Civil War of enlisted soldiers on both sides of the war, as well as what was going on with the families and those left behind. And so that was really kind of how Dr. Ayers got his name on the map, haha, so to speak. But in that time, since then, he founded the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. And when he stepped down as university president, after teaching at UVA for 20 some years, he decided he wanted to turn his attention towards K-12 and K-16 educators. And so he and I are now on a mission to change the way that students, that we teach and the way that students are learning about history and geography and civics. And we want to make it a lot more engaging, more interactive, more inquiry-based. And so we hope that these tools that we are putting out there to everyone out into the universe will be embraced and will make a difference for that 7th grade kid sitting in a history class somewhere thinking, nothing ever happens in this town. This class is boring. Why do we have to study this, right? That's our target audience. So the first tool is Bunk. And I just went ahead and when you look at Bunk, the first time Ed showed it to me, I thought it looked like Nerd Pinterest. I don't know if he thought that was as funny as I did, but every day we are curating content from all sorts of news sources, including Retro Report, from all over the World Wide Web. So we have videos, we have podcasts, we have newspaper, magazines, other print media, blogs, and they're all kind of mixed into this behind the scenes algorithm. And so I did a search while David and Abir were talking for migration, just to kind of show you how this works. So here are all the tags. If I click on the migration tag, we have over 105 pieces of content specifically that mention the word migration, including some of our digital maps and other maps, articles, and videos. If I drill down more specifically to the Great Migration, we have 94 pieces of content that relate to the Great Migration. If we go back and look at forced migration, we have 24 pieces. So you get the idea. But once you click on a piece of content, and I'm just going to use the video that David shared, because Retro Report was one of our earliest partners who said, you know what? We like Bunk so much, we want all of our videos in there. And so now David's folks actually help us put it into Bunk. And so once we ingest an article or a blog or a video or a podcast into Bunk, it goes through a tagging system. And you'll see an excerpt if it's a written document, like an article or newspaper article, magazine. If it's a video, it's embedded right in there. You don't have to worry about those pesky YouTube ads that distract your students and get you in trouble. If it's a podcast, it plays right in there. And then over here, you can kind of choose your own adventure. So do you want to look at things that have the same core idea? Do you want to look at things with the same people in it, the same geographic location? Or do you want to look at it through before, during, and after that time period? So I'm going to just pick idea. And so when you do view connections, now you can flip through this stack of cards and see different pieces of content that relate to that original video. You can also drill down and say, I'd really like to just explore that tag. And you can go to refugees. We have 122 pieces of content on refugees. So it's really kind of this endless way for students to explore and make connections between past and present by geographic location. So that's Bunk. All of our maps that I'm going to show you next, I think almost all the Retro Report videos are in Bunk, and many other pieces of content. So American Panorama, one of the maps, Abir mentioned forced migration and the migration stories of the enslaved. This is an earlier map from the Digital Scholarship Lab that looks at migration patterns. Areas in blue are where people were leaving. Areas in copper or red are where people were moving towards. And similar to the slider tool that David showed you on our foreign born map, as you go through different decades down here at the bottom, you see that we have these very powerful primary source narratives. So you're hearing from the voices of the people who were seeking self-emancipation or who were being forcibly removed from their families, and the forced migration towards the areas where cotton and sugar, because by the early 1800s, we had depleted here on the East Coast, we had depleted the the tobacco crops because we had ruined the soil, right, from overplanting. So as people are being forced to move into areas where sugar and cotton are now king, you can read these heartbreaking stories of family separation, of people trying to self-emancipate. Some were successful, some were not. But you also get that data piece. So if you have a math friend down the hall, you can say, you know, I know that you teach graphs. I know that you teach bubble plots. Why not do it through a history lens and team up with that math teacher? We have these great, explanatory boxes down here that kind of teach kids what are the parts of the map and how they work, and they set that historical context. And so they can go through and kind of start to look for these migration patterns, whether they were on this map, or we have another map that's more recent that looks at migration. This is showing in an animation. This is from Southern Journey, which came from a big, beautiful coffee table book. And I said, Ed, that's great. Schools can't afford it. I need it digital. I need it animated. I need it in GIS. And so our guys said, okay, Annie, we know you're not going to give up, so we're going to make you those maps. I love this animation because on a flat paper map, you know, we read about the Trail of Tears in our textbooks, but this truly shows the large scale cessions of indigenous people and land over time. And you can't get that with a flat map, right? As you scroll through, we're looking at migrations of the American South from 1790 all the way up to COVID. Same color pattern. Blue is where they're leaving. Copper is where they are coming. This is comparing the black and white populations over time. So we look at the Great Migration. We look at the prices of enslaved people. Again, the expulsion of indigenous people a few years later. We continue looking at how indigenous people were forcibly removed from their land farther and farther west. And then this map comes in 3 parts. And so you can look at them. We have learning resources for all 3 sections. So the first part starts as early as Fort Monroe with the enslavement camps around the Civil War era. And then we go all the way up through in part 3 of looking at COVID data geographically as it relates to where people had migrated from, where people live. We have newer maps that show Asian American and Latinx populations. there are tools built in through the story map format, where kids can do comparisons between decades and between different, this is the Black-white population just prior to the Civil War. And so that's one other possibility. Overland trails. This is looking at the California Trail, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail. This summer, Dr. Ayers and I will be leading a 3-part seminar as part of the Gilder Lehrman Teacher Institute. It's back in person finally. So if anyone's looking to enroll in that, we are leading a 3-day session looking at the years 1810 to 1850, because most people just skip over it. They say, okay, Constitution, Civil War. Yeah, not that much happened in between. But really, Dr. Ayers will argue during the course of those 3 days that quite a bit happened during that time. And so we're going to try and bring that to life through maps, excerpts of a new book that he's working on, images, and other interactive tools. So again, just like with the forced migration map here, you can click on different parts of the trail and you can pull up these narratives. This is one person's diary starting in 1843 in June, and you can go all the way till he reaches, some of them don't all reach their destination, right? Some of them don't make it, but this particular person did arrive in Oregon. So primary sources built in, interactive components to the map. There's a slider tool down here again, so you can kind of move it and see who else, who else's narratives you might want to peek in on. I think you've already done a great job highlighting the forced migration map. And the maps that I'm sharing with you, most of them have learning resources that walk students step by step through them. And the ones that don't, we're working on them as fast as we can, and they will eventually be up there. One that we released a learning resource on today on our website is Photogrammer. I'm very excited about this tool. Photogrammer is a way that you can geolocate images from the Great Depression. And so you can look by artist, you can look by geographic location. I'm going to search here for Virginia, or actually I'm going to do California. And so basically you can drill down into areas as specific, if one of the areas is highlighted in purple, then that means that there are images from the Great Depression that were part of this large archive. And so kids can start to see like, oh, well, maybe something interesting did happen in my community after all. So I had a group earlier today that was looking at the images, and they were preparing to take a walking tour of their community to see if they could figure out where those photos were taken and what was there now, right? We've done the same thing with our Green Book lesson, having students kind of compare what was there at this point in time and what is there now. And very compelling stories to go in with these. They all go out to the Library of Congress, which gives you more information about that map and then takes you out to other resources that your students can use to explore. The Backstory Archive. I said we had a lot of audio content built into Bunk, but if you're a Backstory podcast listener from many years, when Backstory ended a couple of years ago, people said, I really wish I could just use that 1 4-minute clip, right? Or there's that 6-minute from that one episode I really like. So I did a search for the Great Migration earlier today, and here are a variety of clips. My favorite is the one that's actually called The Great Migration. It's a gentleman who talks about moving from the South, goes up to Philadelphia. He's applying for a job at an insurance company, and instead they offer him the custodial job. And he comes back and he talks about, how he thought he was moving, to get a better life, provide for his family, but he felt that, he was being discriminated against and he wasn't being allowed to apply for certain jobs. So it's a very compelling story, just one person's journey. There's others down here about families, wrestling with deportation of family members, and then others that talk about the forced migration and immigration aspects of African Americans over time. Dr. Ayers hosted a very interesting video series for 2.5 seasons called The Future of America's Past. All of those episodes are also embedded into Bonk. We also have learning resources created for those. This particular episode on Transcontinental talks about Chinese immigrants, Irish immigrants, and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So we're looking at it through geography, we're looking at it through immigration, we're looking at it through history lens, and also through an environmental lens. So you can pull the science teacher in, right? You can pull the math teacher in looking at data and statistics. You can teach the history and the geography. We hope that you will make these cross-curricular. The most well-recognized map by far of everything that we've done is Mapping Inequality. Mapping Inequality shows patterns of what was called redlining, when after the Great Depression, during the New Deal, they scored and rated neighborhoods in communities that had 40,000 or more people. Bankers and realtors were enlisted to fill out a template. This is my old neighborhood. I lived in the Fan in Richmond on Monument Avenue. We all saw how that landscape has changed in the last 18 months. But we have the original primary source scanned documents. These were the forms that people filled out when they assigned a color: red meaning hazardous, yellow meaning declining, blue meaning still pretty good, green was considered the best. As you can imagine, the blue and green neighborhoods were all white neighborhoods. Yellow neighborhoods were predominantly immigrant families, Jewish families, some families of color. And then red neighborhoods were almost all exclusively African-American. This was a pattern all across the United States. So students can explore these stories through these primary source documents. They can do it through the map. They can relate to their own family immigration stories. And then we do a Where Are They Now sort of a map as a part 2 to this. My old neighborhood was declining because these big mansions after the Great Depression have been turned into apartments. But now it's been, because of gentrification, it's the hipster neighborhood. They've rebranded it the Museum District, and it's very expensive to live there now. I probably couldn't live there. And then for your science teachers, the urban heat island studies, looking at the way that people living in red and yellow line neighborhoods now are literally sweltering in the summer. We dumped all of the words that were used in those area descriptions, those scanned documents I showed you of Monument Avenue where I used to live. Every neighborhood in the country that was part of that Hulk redlining system, here are the words that most frequently were used to describe the red neighborhoods, the yellow neighborhoods, the blue and the green. And when you let students examine this, and I have one without the words, without this little white box in the way and just the image, and I have a See, Think, Wonder activity I do, and kids really get it. Like they start looking at each of the individual words, and then they go out and read some of those scanned documents about certain neighborhoods, and they start looking for those words in the text. And then we had some really interesting conversations this week. Abir mentioned Los Angeles and Silicon Valley. These kids are living in the part of Los Angeles that was east of Silicon Valley, where they are, the interstate highway system went through and tore through the red line neighborhoods. These kids have higher rates of asthma. Their family members have diabetes, heart disease. And that all relates back to the lasting effects of living in those neighborhoods without shade trees, without clean air. So we could go on all night, but we're already 4 minutes over time. We have lots more maps. I have learning resources built for many, and we're working as fast as we can. We have immersive reader built in. It'll read aloud. Everything you need for the lesson. This is the teacher version with the standards and teaching tips, but the kid version, kids don't want to look at that. So we have a version for kids that doesn't have, but all the images, all the inquiry-based questions, templates, graphic organizers, step-by-step directions on how to use the maps are all in one place. So you only need this one URL, put it in your Canvas course, your Google Classroom, and everything else you need is right there for the kids.
Excellent. Thank you. So, and again, I know we shared a ton of resources. We will reshare them with you in an email tomorrow. I know. And Annie, I did have a request from somebody in the chat with the images that you had posted in the slide deck that we'll share. I know sometimes you link on the images themselves.
Everything that all these maps I showed you and more, I'm going to put in the presenter notes on the slides.
Perfect.
And also give you the invite if you want to sign up for the Gilder Lehrman thing this summer. We would love to have you all. It's going to be a great 3 days. I will put I think I put most of them, but if not, I'll put all the links to everything in those slides. So that you can easily find them. And my email's there. I can do free PD. I can come in through Zoom. I can teach your class. I can walk them through any of the lessons. I can do your PLC and kind of share with you and your colleagues how these work. I do division-wide PD through Zoom, or depending on your location, sometimes I show up in person, especially if there's coffee. So we're creating this stuff. David and I have teamed up, Abir, Adam, her colleague, Dr. Ayers. We just want to help you guys get kids really interested in history and civics and geography. That is our main goal.
And I know Annie mentioned the reworked mapping inequality and some of those updates that are coming. I know Annie and I are in a preliminary conversation about our next round of webinars using some of those resources when they're ready, along with a brand new set of films looking at evictions during the pandemic coming from Retro Report. So we thank you very much for joining us tonight. We will be happy to stick around and answer questions if folks have them, but otherwise expect to hear from me and from Annie as well. And we will we'll provide all of these resources to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.